Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I share with you a compilation of some of my favorite Distress ink techniques for doing backgrounds. For all of these, I'm using Distress Mixed Media Heavystock, and I'm using the same three colors. So the three colors I'm using are Picked Raspberry, Wilted Violet, and Salty Ocean, but you can use whatever colors you want with this. I would suggest as a beginner choosing colors that are in this, like next to each other on the color wheel. So you wouldn't want to choose, say, red and green to start, because when they blend together, they're going to start to make brown. And as you get to know your colors, you're going to be able to know what colors will work and which ones you like and whatnot. So the first technique I'm doing is just a very simple background. We're doing it with Distress inks. Distress inks are a dye-based ink that have water reactive properties. This technique will work with any other ink that has water reactive properties. Distress inks are the only ones that I know, but I know there are a few others out there. These ones are my favorite, and I've had them in my collection for many years. Like I said, I'm working on Distress Mixed Media Heavystock. This is a Heavystock mixed media paper that can handle some water and moisture. So what I did was I pressed each one of the ink colors a couple times on my mat, that is the white area to the side of the screen. And then I sprayed some water on it to add a little bit of flowability to the inks. I took my mixed media paper and pressed it into that ink. And then in between each pressing, I'm taking my Heat It tool and I am drying. Now, it doesn't need to be 100% dry. 80-90% is good, but you want to make sure that it's mostly dry. If you dip these inks into each other when they're wet, they're just going to blend together. If you let them dry in between, they're going to layer on top of each other. You will still get some blending, but you'll have more layers and more texture if you let it dry between. The Heat It tool just helps to speed up the process because I can speed up the drying time. You could use an embossing gun to do this drying, but you're going to want to be a little bit more careful with an embossing gun because it's got a more intense heat to it. So you'll have to hold it away from the paper to not scorch and burn it and to curl the paper. So for this particular technique, the Heat It tool works much better and it's a little bit more friendly. You can layer the inks as many times as you want. I typically do 3 or 4 times. I find that's the sweet spot for me. If you like it before 3 or 4 times, then leave it like that. If you want to add more, you can add more and layer on top even more. Now, I'm going to do the same technique, but we're going to use Distress Oxides, and I'll show you the difference between the two at the end. Once again, I'm using the Mixed Media Heavystock. I'm using that throughout the whole video for all my techniques here. Any paper that can handle some moisture will likely work for this. Mixed Media Heavystock is my favorite for this. So the way that Distress Oxides differ from Distress inks is Distress inks are dye-based. Distress Oxides are a blend of dye and pigment. So it has the dye properties of the Distress ink, but it also has pigment properties which make it more opaque. The oxides oxidize when water is added, which means it gives them a frosty look to it. So you'll see as we create this background, the technique for it is exactly the same. I'm dipping the paper into the inks after I have put the ink on the mixed media mat and added water. I'm drying in between. Once again, 80-90% is good. It doesn't need to be 100% dry. If by chance you get a large puddle of ink that it's just too much, you don't want it, you can take some paper towel and you can blot some of the excess moisture out of that to help. It will remove some of that ink. And as you use these techniques, you'll get to know what you like and what you don't like. But I encourage you to experiment and play around with different color combinations and just have fun with the process as you're learning it. You'll get to see the ink on the side mat starts to be more concentrated and more dotty, if you will, and that creates the blotches and the dots on your background. Once again, I like to do it about 3 or 4 times. You can do it as much or as little as you want. And there's the difference between the two. So you can see a distinct difference between those two backgrounds. So now let's make the same background, but we're going to do a combination of the dyes as well as the pigment inks. So there's no rhyme or reason as to which goes on the mat. I'm just squeezing each one once, except I do the blue, I think, a second time because I realized that I had the 2 blues right beside each other and I didn't want that. Once again, I am spraying with water, tapping it in once. And when I tap it in the first time, I tend to try to get as much coverage on my background as possible. It's not necessary for it to be completely covered. Some of the paper showing in the background makes an interesting background. It just depends on the look that you're going for, but I do try to tend to make sure that I've got as much coverage as possible for it. Now, once again, I'm using my heated tool between times to dry the ink, but you can see as I'm going, there's absolutely no way to get two exact backgrounds alike. And that's what makes this process so interesting, is even if you tried to make two identical backgrounds, you couldn't if you tried. So every single background that you do with this is unique, which makes it, in my opinion, a lot more interesting and a lot more fun. Just like before, we are drawing between each and every layer, tapping, and you can tend to see what colors of ink are on that mat. So say I have an area that's all pink and I want some blue or purple on top of it, I can tap it into those areas and have that control to get those backgrounds blended and get colors all over my background. Now, rest assured, as we're going through this isn't the only way you can do a background with distress inks, and I'll show you more of them as the video progresses, but I just wanted you to see this process and this technique with the different videos or different inks so that you can compare the two and just kind of see some of the things that it can do. So there's the three backgrounds. The one on the left is distress, the middle one is oxide, and the one on the right is the blend of the two. Now let's take that same distress oxide background, but we're going to change up the cardstock that we're using. So I'm going to use some alcohol ink cardstock. Alcohol ink cardstock is a glossy cardstock. It's a clay coated cardstock. So it looks shiny and non-porous, but it is actually porous. I've put my oxide inks on the side mat, and I'm going to do the process exactly the same. I'm going to tap my paper into the ink and heat it between each and every layer. Now we're doing this on the glossy side of the paper. We're not doing this on the matte side of the paper. And as we progress and as the inks layer together, we're going to have some inks that seep into the glossy cardstock and some that stay on the surface. The ones that stay on the surface are going to look a little bit like a hot mess, but there's something that we're going to do at the end, and it's going to bring out all of the colors that have seeped into the paper, and it's going to look really, really cool. Now, before I forget to say this, all of the supplies and the colors and everything that I'm using for each one of these techniques will be listed and linked in the description down below. So if there's anything that I'm saying too fast or you miss, you'll probably find that information down below, so check down there. Now you can see as I'm progressing with this background that the top layer, it's kind of all blending into one color. You're not seeing as much of the individual colors as you saw on the mixed media Heavystock. So it doesn't look as impressive or as interesting as some of the other backgrounds do, but just wait. Like I said, it gets really good, but we have to do this process in order to create the background that we want. So once again, dipping in, using the heated tool to dry. And once again, I could let it air dry between each and every layer. It's just going to take a lot longer to do that. So the tool to dry it is going to help. Now, the heated tool, even though it looks like a blow dryer, it's not a blow dryer. It doesn't blow air, it emits heat. And it is a gentle heat, so it's not going to warp the paper. So those are the two backgrounds. And now we're going to take some Distress Micro Glaze, and we're going to use a tool that has a sponge at the end, and we're just going to buff it along the surface there. And then I'm going to take a piece of paper towel or a napkin, and I'm going to take that excess microglaze off, and we'll show you the difference between the two. Isn't that cool how it reveals the dye underneath? Now let's do the rest of the piece of cardstock and buff the excess off so that you can see the whole piece. Now for this video, I didn't use these backgrounds in projects. I'm just creating the backgrounds just so that you can see some different things that you can do with these inks and have fun with them. I will use these backgrounds in future projects, and anytime I do, I'll put a link to those videos in the description box below. Not sure how soon that's going to happen, but it will happen. So now let's take the regular distress background and we'll add some shimmer to it. So I've got some Perfect Pearls here. I've already stamped the ink onto my mat. I just took a Slurpee straw. You could use a little scoop, a spoon, a knife or whatever, just to put little piles of that mica powder onto the ink before we spray it with water. Now, if you're not familiar with Perfect Pearls, it is a mica powder that has a binding agent in it that is activated by water. So this technique is perfect to use with Perfect Pearls because we are spraying water on there. So it will seal that perfect pearl with the ink, so you won't have it flaking off or rubbing off when your background is done. The process itself is exactly the same as all the other distress backgrounds. I tapped my paper into the ink, used my Heat It tool to dry it, and then I'm going to continue tapping. And the cool thing about the mica powder in this is you'll see different layers and splotches and veins of it as we progress through doing the background. So it creates a really, really interesting look. And by adding that little shimmery effect, it just makes a more interesting background than just a plain matte, flat, inked background. Perfect pearls come in so many different colors. The one that I use for this particular technique is called Mint, because I just thought it would coordinate with the colors really nicely. But it comes in so many different colors, so you're not limited to only a couple of colors to choose. You can choose whatever color you want. And the cool thing about Perfect Pearls is with the binding agent that's activated by water, you can use it for watercoloring, you can use it to brush over stamped images. I use it quite often in my videos, and you'll see me throwing it in here and there. So it's a very versatile tool to have in your craft room because it's got so many uses to it, this being just one of my favorites. So we're nearing the end of this background. I've lost count of how many times I've tapped it in. I think this might be the last time that I'm doing it. Once again, we are going to dry it, and then I'll show you a view of the finished background. And you'll be able to see the beautiful shimmer that Perfect Pearls adds to that background. It's nice, subtle, and because the color is very similar to the colors used, it just creates an interesting background. Now, anytime I do these backgrounds here, I try not to waste the ink that's left on my back or my mat there. So I just took another piece of Distress Mixed Media Heavystock, and we're going to use this to create some embellishments for future cards. So because there's not as much ink on that mat as when I first started, I'm not going to get a complete background. I'm going to see a lot more of the Mixed Media Heavystock than I do in my other backgrounds. But it creates some interesting areas and some interesting texture onto cardstock, which is perfect for doing die cuts. You could do flowers, you could do leaves. For this particular one, I'm going to do some birds. So that's our background there. I'm taking some bird dies, and I am going to tape them in place before I die cut them, just so that I can pick and choose exactly what part gets die cut out of each bird. And these type of embellishments are things that I'll set alone to the side or put in a container with a bunch of different die cuts. And I'll just pick and choose different die cuts when I'm creating projects. It's nice to have these things handy just to grab whenever you need it. You can also ink these or do more stuff on top of them when you are done. But there's a fun way to use up some excess that you may usually just wipe up and discard. So now we're going to use our distress inks in a different way. So I've got some blending brushes here, and we're going to blend those colors onto the background. Once again, I'm using the same colors just for simplicity for this video, but you can use whatever color combinations you want. For these, I'm just doing a stripe of each color down the center of, or down the cardstock. You don't necessarily just need to blend in this way. I just want you to be able to see the different effects that the different colors have with the techniques that we are doing. Some are going to be more subtle than others. You want to make sure to use a nice generous amount of the ink and get good coverage on your background here. So we could just blend our background like this and leave it as is, but I'm taking some water, spraying it into my hand, and then I'm just going to flick it onto that background there so that you can see exactly how that ink reacts on the distress ink when it's just blended onto a background. So I'm using my Heat It tool once again, just to speed up the process to dry that ink. You can easily just let it dry naturally. If you find you have too much water in areas and it starts to pool, you can take a piece of paper towel and just lift it up. You'll notice as you lift it up, it removes the ink as well. So you see more of a difference between the blended areas and where the water was. You can continue to add splotches of water if you notice areas that are missing blotches or spots. One thing to keep in mind, as you may have noticed while I was picking up some of the excess, make sure to use a dry area of your paper towel when you move to different areas. Otherwise, you're going to transfer the moisture from your paper towel onto your blended background. Now we're going to do the same background but with Distress Oxides. so you can see the difference. Now, oxides tend to get the frosted look when you spray them with water. And for this particular background, we're not spraying the entire thing with water, so you're not going to see that. But what you are going to see is just those areas where the water flicks go. And for this particular technique, it actually looks very similar to just the distress inks. So this isn't the best use of oxides. You may have noticed me grab the wrong brush. I grabbed my blue brush to go in my pink, so just make sure to grab the right brush when you're doing it. It's not a huge thing because they're similar color tones. As I continue to use my inks, that pad will get cleaned off, but just be careful when you're doing that. So once again, I'm going to take the water and spray it into my hand, and then I'm splattering it onto my background there. And I'm going to take that heated tool once again, and I'm going to dry those ink splats. Now, one thing to note is you need separate blending brushes for your oxides and for your distress inks. Because they're two different blends, you can't mix and match the two with your blending brushes. I learned that the hard way. I happened to have a bunch of brushes that I was using with dye inks, used the blue one with oxide, and was never able to get it to work properly with dye inks again, even after washing it out a half a dozen times. So just keep a separate set of brushes for your oxides and for your distress inks. So I just showed you the two backgrounds there, and you'll notice for this particular technique, you don't see a whole lot of difference between the two. Now, I did notice while I was blending those oxide backgrounds that my oxide pads were getting a little bit dry. So I thought I'd share with you how I like to refill my pads. Because the oxides are a blend of dye and pigment ink, they will separate in the refill bottles. So when you shake them, you'll hear a metal ball that's in there that's to help mix the two together. If you don't hear that ball, tap it onto your desk or a table to release that ball and use it to shake. If you're not hearing that ball, it means that it's lodged in the pigment sludge at the bottom, and it's not going to be able to mix your pigment and dye together before you add it to the pad. And you definitely want to make sure that it's mixed really, really well before you add it to the pad. When you put it on the pad, I tend to go around the perimeter and then I kind of zigzag in the center. If your pad is really, really dry, it's going to soak that ink in really quickly. If it's not super dry, it's going to soak it in a lot slower. So I just watch the rate that the ink is soaking in. My pads, I've never refilled these ones, so they're quite dry. Relatively, they're not completely dry. They obviously had ink coming out of them when I blended those backgrounds, but they did take quite a bit of ink to refill. Now, while we're on that subject, this is how you refill a regular distress pad. They come in bottles with little dropper tops. So you just squeeze in some ink, and I use the same method. I put around the outside edges and then zigzag my way in between. Just the same as the oxides. You'll notice if they are really dry, they will suck in the ink really, really fast. As the pad gets refilled, it'll suck it in a little bit slower. Once I've refilled my ink pad, I'll set it aside to dry, and I set it aside to soak into the pad, and I don't really use them for about an hour afterwards. I want to make sure that that ink has time to just really soak into the pad. If I was in the middle of stamping and needed to use it right away, what I would do would be to lightly ink the pad just so that the surface has some fresh ink on it. And then I would use like an old credit card, plastic card, or typically something that's non-porous, just to push that ink around to make sure I've got a nice even coat on the top there. But I tend to have an idea when my pads need re-inking, so I don't really run into that in the middle of stamping. But you definitely wouldn't want to re-ink liberally and then stamp right away. You're going to get a blotchy result that way. You'll notice with this pad here, I'm just taking that dropper and going around the edges. When my pad is extra dry, I find that just going around the edges just helps soak in some ink a little bit more. It could be just in my head, but I just do it that way anyways. Never mind my ink stained hands. When I was taking my oxide re-inkers out of the bin that I have them stored in, some of them had leaked, so I went and cleaned my whole bin and I got ink all over me. So for this next technique, we're going to create a background and we're going to add some texture with a stencil. So I want to make sure that I have a lot of ink on my background. So I just took my pad and put it straight to the paper. And then I'm using my blending brush just to blend between the two colors. You just want to make sure when you're doing this that you get a lot of ink on there. And the reason for that is we want to be able to see a distinct difference between the pattern of the stencil and the background. And you get that best by having a lot of ink on there. Now, these techniques that I'm showing you from here on are going to work a lot better with vibrant colors. You're going to see the difference a lot more. If you have paler or pastel colors, you're not going to be able to see the texture or the pattern quite as easily as you do with dark colors. Now, another thing, and I showed that cleaning off my desk area, you want to make sure to wipe off your desk with a baby wipe or a wet cloth and then dry it while you're doing these techniques. If you let the ink dry on your surface and then go to do something else, you'll rehydrate the ink and transfer it up. So make sure to clean between techniques. So I put my ink blended background onto my Big Shot machine, put the stencil on top, and then I'm taking a baby wipe and I am stacking my plate on top of there and putting it through my machine. Now, the baby wipe has just the perfect amount of moisture to it. You could use paper towel or a napkin and spray it with water. It's going to take a little bit of experimenting to figure out the right amount to use. So I tend to have baby wipes in my craft room. Just it makes cleanup super easy. So this is the perfect thing to use for this particular technique. Once you've got the ink in that baby wipe, I'm just going to toss it away. You don't want to be using it for other things, although you probably could put it on another piece of paper and put it through the machine again just to see what transferred out. Now I wanted to take that exact technique and just tweak it a little bit. So I've got my ink blended background. I did it off screen just because it's exactly the same as the first one. Put my stencil on top. This time I'm going to take that baby wipe and I'm going to fold it in half. And what this is going to do, it's going to tighten the sandwich I have on my die cutting machine. And it's also going to put more moisture on that concentrated area. So you'll notice as I put it through the machine that some ink squeezes out as I'm running it through. It's not going to harm your machine or your plates at all. You do want to make sure that you wipe that off before you go and work on your next technique or next project, because that ink will likely transfer over if you don't do that. So because of that tightened sandwich, you'll notice that we have a little bit more texture in this background. And because of that extra moisture, you see more of a distinct difference between that stenciled background and the inked background. So I just wanted you to be able to see that, and that way you can play around with how tight your sandwich is and how much moisture you're using to get the desired that you want. Once again, make sure to clean off your plates in your machine before you go and work on another technique, because we don't want to ruin a future project with ink that we didn't clean up. And I'm saying this because I've been guilty of doing this in the past. All right, so now we're going to add some pearlized texture onto the back of our background. So the ink blended background is exactly the same as the last two that we just did. I am taking my stencil and I'm taping it down so that it doesn't shift during this technique. You could hold it in place, but it's much easier to have it taped down. I'm just using some simple painter's tape that I have in my craft room. And then I'm taking some Perfect Pearls and I'm going to put it over my background, over the stencil with a soft brush. You want to make sure that when you're using Perfect Pearls in this way that you don't have a lot of excess. So I dip my brush in there and I blend it around until I don't have any more Perfect Pearls to blend it around, and then I go and get some more. The other thing you could do, if you happen to dip your brush into your Perfect Pearls and you get too much, you can tap it on the side of your pot to get the excess off your brush. And there we have some pearlized texture on our background. Now, because Perfect Pearls have a binding agent that's activated with water, we do need to mist it lightly in order to activate that binding agent so that those pearls won't rub off with your fingers. And then you're going to set that aside to completely dry before you use it on whatever else you're doing. So for our last technique here, we're going to do that same ink blended background. I put my ink pads right onto the paper to get a nice heavy concentration of ink. And then I use my heated tool or my embossing tool to set the ink on the background. Now, distress inks have resins in them, and if you don't heat set your background, you try to do embossing over top of them, that embossing powder is going to stick to anything that those resins haven't set in. And you'll see here that I didn't use my heat tool, my embossing tool long enough. You could use your heat tool for this, but I wanted to make sure that it was done really well. So I took my embossing gun out, as well as the fact that I was going to be using it for doing the embossing anyways. But I kept this in the video because I wanted to show you what happens if you don't set it long enough. And I also wanted to share with you right after this how to test if it's set long enough and how to fix it. So once you've stamped an image onto your background and put embossing powder on it, there's not really a way to fix it other than wait for everything to dry and brush it off, and you can use that background for something else. So I took this one and I set it aside. You can't even see the pattern from the stamped image. That's how I needed to set it a lot longer. So I did another ink blended background, and this time I'm going to use my embossing gun to set it. And before I go and stamp my image, I will share with you how I test it to see if those resins have set enough so that the powder will not stick to them. So I did it for what I thought was long enough, because I typically don't do a lot of embossing over distressed backgrounds unless they've been sitting for a while and have had a long time to dry. I just tried to see if they were set enough, and you could see that it stuck to the background. So I just took a soft brush and brushed that right off. It makes it really easy to do it this way when you haven't stamped an image on there. It's really easy to keep checking. Now, even though that last little blast with the tool looked like it wasn't very long, I cut it out. You didn't need to see me sit there with the embossing tool. So I was just sharing with you that I did use my heat tool longer and then tested it. So once again, I did it again, and now we've got it pretty good at not sticking to my background. I am going to take an embossing buddy, which is a tool that you use with embossing. It helps to put powder on your background so that the embossing powder only sticks to where you want it to. This is great for reducing any fingerprints that may pick up the embossing powder because of oils from your fingers. Once I know that that embossing powder is only going to stick to my stamped image, I'm putting my embossing ink on my stamp, and I'm going to stamp the background. This technique will work with whatever stamps you want to use. I think it looks best with a background stamp, but if you wanted to use image stamps, you could use that and cover your background that way. Make sure to press firmly all around your stamp to make sure that you've got good coverage. And then you're going to take your background and you're going to pour your clear powder over top of this. And once we've got it covering the whole background, we're going to tap off any excess, and we're going to use our embossing gun to melt that powder. In order to remove any powder that's sticking where I don't want it to, I will typically flick the back of my cardstock really firmly just to remove that. You'll do that with regular cardstock anyways. When you are adding embossing powder, it tends to stick sometimes where you don't want it to stick. But you do want to make sure to remove any powder that's not sticking where you don't want it to before you use your embossing tool. Now, to emboss, I'm using an embossing tool that's specifically meant for this. You could use the heated tool for this. The only thing is the heated tool is a little bit more gentle, so it's going to take a little bit longer to actually melt the powder to do your background. But you absolutely can. If you only have the heated tool or one tool, you can do that. Now that our embossing is completely done, I'm going to take another piece of mixed media Heavystock, and I'm going to use some of my painter's tape that I used to hold down my stencil a few minutes ago, and I'm going to tape those two backgrounds together. The reason for this is we're going to put those two backgrounds together with some moisture and put it through the Big Shot machine for the pressure. And by taping them together, if I want to mist my paper again, I can easily do that and have those patterns line up perfectly without having to worry about trying to make sure that they are lined up. Now, I put a little bit too much moisture on here, so you see there was some running of my ink, but that's okay. This background will still work. I'm putting it through the machine as if I was die cutting. We're doing a lot of non-die cutting with this machine today. And that's going to put some pressure onto that inked background and that mixed media Heavystock, and it's going to transfer the ink over to the other side of the paper. Now those lines that I have on there are not because of the background, it's because of the excess moisture I had on there the first time around. Just so you know, when you try this, don't put quite as much. So I took some scrap paper there to protect the non-embossed side so that I could spray the embossed side again and then put it through the machine yet again. And you'll see that even more ink has transferred over by doing this. Once this is done, you can just set them aside to completely dry and then remove the painter's tape. Not best to remove the painter's tape while it's still wet because you're just going to rip paper. But it's a great way to get two backgrounds out of one with a fun texture to it. And if you wanted to step this up even more, you could spray it with a shimmer spray instead of water to add some shimmer to the backgrounds there. So here's a quick look at all the backgrounds we completed in this video. I hope you found it helpful, and thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Have a great day.